Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture for Intro to Mind and Will. All right, let's get started. Okay, so what is the mind-body problem? That's going to be the topic that actually is going to consume most of our time for, I'd say, the first half of the semester here. To first explore the problem, we're going to look at NAGEL'S The Mind-Body Problem. It comes out of a small book of his that's supposed to be sort of like an introduction to philosophy. Okay, so what is the mind, right? Well, within the philosophy of mind, there's a myriad of questions. Here's just a few of them. What makes me the same person over time, right? Are the choices I make really free? We're going to get to that towards the end of the semester. Am I the author of my own thoughts? And what is the nature of consciousness? Now, of course, there's many more questions than these. These are just some examples of questions you might encounter in the philosophy of mind. But most importantly, at least for us right now, what is the mind, right? What exactly is it? Okay, the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is exactly that problem. Like, what is the mind? More specifically, how does it relate to our body, right? So how do the mind and the body relate? It seems like they're interconnected in at least some ways, right? Like if I stub my toe, I feel pain. It seems to be like a mental kind of experience. But when I get the idea to stand from my chair, right, I can put that idea into action by moving my body. The idea of having the chair seems to belong to my mind, whereas the action that comes about as a result seems to emanate from my body, right? It seems like the two are intimately interconnected in at least some ways. It seems as though thoughts can translate into bodily action, and bodily sensation can translate into mental experience. And perhaps there's other ways that the two are interconnected. But the real question is whether or not the mind is distinct from the body, right? Is the mind just part of the body, or is it somehow something more, right? Some philosophers argue that it cannot be distinct from the body, that perhaps the mind is just the brain, right? Or maybe the story is a bit more complicated, but in any case, the mind, whatever it is, has to be a physical thing. Other philosophers think that the mind is entirely distinct from the body. It's its own thing, right? You have a mind and you have a body. And maybe they kind of like communicate with one another or interact with one another in certain ways, but they are entirely different things. Okay, we're gonna sort of explore both of these views as we go on in the next like 6 to 7 weeks. But to begin, we're gonna start with Thomas Nagel, right? Nagel, he does a pretty good job at like explaining to us why this problem carries such weight. But he's also going to kind of put his own view forward, and he's not really going to be apologetic about it. So note that as you read this piece, Nagel is, he's trying to argue his case. He's not exactly giving like the full arguments for the other competing positions, but we'll get to those ourselves in the next few coming weeks. Okay, so let's jump into Nagel here. This is Nagel. Here's a quote from him. Each of our lives is a part of the lengthy process of the universe gradually waking up and becoming aware of itself. Not from our reading, but interesting nonetheless. Let's jump into his paper that we're concerned with today, though, the mind-body problem. Okay, so he begins by conceding that there's some obvious interactions going on between the mind and the brain. He says, quote, "You would not feel any pain from stubbing your toe if the nerves in your leg and spine did not carry impulses from the toe to your brain." Right? So it seems obvious that there are some phenomena, some physical phenomena, that are intimately related to mental ones. Right? Nagel wants to acknowledge that this is the case. But we don't exactly understand how these two phenomena relate. We know that they do, but we don't know how they do. Right? Nagel's point that we're going to see sort of reified throughout this paper of his is that we can observe those physical things without being able to observe the mental things, right? The two seem to come apart in that way. I can see you stub your toe, and I can take measurements of the nerves in your body, but I can't really take a measurement of your mental goings on. At least that's what Nagel is going to end up trying to argue here. Okay. But all of this so far, that when certain physical things happen, certain mental things happen, right? Nagel says that's still, that's in the realm of science, right? When a physical thing causes your brain to behave in certain ways and that produces some kind of mental activity, that's kind of in the realm of science. What we are interested in as philosophers is whether or not that mental stuff, the mind, is something different from your brain, right? Is it the same thing as your brain? Is it just an expression of your brain? Or is it somehow distinct? Okay. If we can identify activity in the brain that co-occurs with activity in the mind, isn't it natural to assume that the two are the same, right? Like when I stub my toe, my brain lights up in certain ways at the exact same time that I'm having this experience of pain. So isn't it natural to assume that these two things are the same, right? The lighting up in my brain and the experience of pain. Nagel wants to give us an example that kind of muddies the water here, right? Like maybe this intuition isn't so clear. Maybe we should not help ourselves to this intuition. It's the case of the chocolate bar, right? Here's a quote. What happens, for instance, when you bite into a chocolate bar? The chocolate melts on your tongue and causes chemical changes in your taste buds. The taste buds send some electrical impulses along the nerves leading from your tongue to your brain. And when those impulses reach the brain, they produce further physical changes there. Finally, you taste the taste of chocolate. What is that? Could it just be a physical event in some of your brain cells? Or does it have to be something of a completely different kind? Okay, so Nagel is drawing this distinction then between the physical goings on in your body and your brain and the actual experience, the taste of chocolate. The taste of chocolate, he wants to say, doesn't seem like the kind of thing that I can point to when I'm pointing at your brain, right? The taste as you experience it, like you taste the chocolate bar, you have the taste of chocolate for you, doesn't seem to be present when we look at the brain, right? Okay, so the taste of chocolate seems distinct in some way from the events occurring in your brain. To drive the point further, he has a supposed brain scientist, right, who's monitoring our brains while we're eating the chocolate bar. And the question is, are they going to be able to see the taste of chocolate while examining our brain, right? So they are witnessing all of these electrochemical events, all these neurons firing. Anywhere in that, are they seeing the taste of chocolate? Nagel says no. He says they're seeing a lot of complicated neural activity, they're seeing a lot of gray matter, but they're not going to see that experience of chocolate. They might even be able to see something that they could label as the experience of chocolate, right? They might be able to see something that's like, well, every time the subject tastes chocolate, this certain area of the brain lights up. But Nagel wants to suggest that seeing that brain activity is not the same thing as capturing the experience of tasting the chocolate. There's a difference between the taste and the sort of physical activity going on in the brain. Okay, he takes it further, right? This is a bit silly, but it makes a good point. He takes it further and considers what would happen if the scientists were to, like, in the name of science, right, lick your brain or taste your brain while you're enjoying the chocolate bar, right? He suggests that it's incredibly unlikely that the scientists would taste chocolate while doing this, but even if they did, they would not be tasting what you taste. They would be tasting their own taste of chocolate, not yours, right? So even doing that, they would not be capturing the experience that you are having in eating the chocolate bar. Okay, so here's a quote. Your experiences are inside your mind with a kind of insideness that is different from the way that your brain is inside your head. Someone else can open up your head and see what's inside, but they cannot cut open your mind and look into it, at least not in the same way. Okay, so for Nagel, it seems like mental phenomena have this property. He's calling it a kind of insideness, right? It's a kind of subjectivity. These mental experiences, these mental phenomena, whether they be experiences, ideas, whatever, they seem to belong to you. They seem to belong to you in a way that I, as an external observer, cannot get direct access to. You might be able to tell me about them, right? Like, oh yeah, this tastes like chocolate, right? But you reporting that to me does not share with me directly the taste, right? It does not share with me directly the experience that you are having, okay? So Nagel then is pushing back on this idea that the mind just is the brain, or that the mind just is like physically explainable just by looking at like neural activity and that sort of thing. Because we can look at neural activity. You know, someone, as he says, can open your skull and can see the neural activity as you're enjoying a bar of chocolate, but they cannot see the taste of chocolate. It seems like there might be some tension here between the two things, right? They're different. It seems as though Nagel is driving us to accepting that mental phenomena and the physical phenomena are somewhat distinct, right? Probably because of this property of insideness or base subjectivity, right? Okay, let's unpack the intuition a bit more. If Nagel is right that our mental lives have a kind of insideness or subjectivity that our bodies simply don't have, then the issue of how our minds relate to our bodies kind of gets really tricky, right? Well, we already kind of acknowledged that when I stub my toe, right, like a physical event, I experience something mental, yeah? Well, if you're saying that these two things aren't the same in some respect, now we're on the hook for a story as to how they're related at all, right? Now we start to get into the mind-body problem more deeply. Okay. So how do we make sense of this? Nagel says there's a few possible positions. There are more positions than the ones that he offers, but he offers I would say, the primary contenders. Okay. So first up, we might think that there is something entirely apart from the body that makes our mental lives possible. Nagel suggests we might think of this as something like a soul, right? So we might have our body with all the nerves and the brain and everything, and we might have a soul otherwise, right? That is entirely not physical. It's something totally distinct, right? A different kind of substance, you might say. So you have the soul, you have the body, and these two things kind of relate together in some way, right? Maybe they send messages to one another, but they aren't the same thing. This is a position known as dualism, right? So next week, we're going to dive into Descartes. And Descartes is like the most notorious dualist there is in the philosophy of mind, okay? So we'll look at some reasons for why you might want to be a dualist then. Okay, but for now, just note that that is what dualism is. Dual, right? So two different kinds of substances. One for mind, one for body. They're not the same thing. So how do the mind and body relate? Well, they're not the same thing. They're just not the same thing. They're distinct substances. Okay. Second, we could just insist that no, the mind has to be a physical thing, right? As Nagel says here, he's mimicking a physicalist. He doesn't actually think this. Everything else in the world is made of physical matter, different combinations of the same chemical elements. Why shouldn't we be? This should say, why shouldn't we be? Right? Okay, so the view that everything that exists has to be physical is just called physicalism. It used to be in fashion to call this materialism, right? They're the same thing, okay? Physicalism, materialism, same idea. So in this view, there is no special substance called the mind or the soul, right? Anything that exists has to be physical. Now, as it relates to the mind-body problem, there are a number of different views that would be called physicalist, right? Some physicalists are going to say that, like the mind, it just is the brain. Other physicalists are going to say the story is a bit more complicated than that. And some small group of physicalists might even say, look, there's no such thing as the mind, right? Like, yeah, Nagel, you're right. It would be too difficult to capture that kind of thing in a physical explanation. So, you know what? Since everything has to be everything needs a physical explanation, let's just ditch the idea of the mind then, right? That's a small, like a minority of philosophers that would say something like that. But they're out there. We're going to look into the different types of physicalism after we cover dualism. So how could physicalism be the case if the taste of chocolate can't be observed? Right? If we can't witness that taste of chocolate that someone is experiencing when they're tasting the chocolate bar, how can we possibly hope to capture all of that with a picture that's purely physicalistic? Well, Nagel suggests that the physicalist often uses this move, right? That, look, things in nature appear to be extremely complicated, if not incomprehensible, sometimes until we understand them, right? Or they seem to be incredibly counterintuitive until we understand them. For example, this is an example Nagel gives. The fact that diamonds are composed of carbon, which also forms coal, is not immediately obvious upon looking at them, right? When you look at a diamond and all its luster, right, you don't immediately conclude this is exactly made of the same stuff as this, holding up a lump of coal, right? It's not intuitively obvious. So Nagel is suggesting that physicalists are going to rely on the same move to suggest that, hey, look, we know this mental stuff might seem weird, but look, we just have work to do, right? We just have work to do to make it make sense. Yeah, but we could get there. Now, of course, Nagel thinks that's going to be impossible. Why? Well, he kind of argues on behalf of the dualist here. Here's a quote. To discover that tasting chocolate was really just a brain process, we would have to analyze something mental, not an externally observed physical substance, but an inner taste sensation in terms of parts that are physical. And there is no way that a large number of physical events in the brain, however complicated, could be the parts out of which a taste sensation was composed. A physical whole can be analyzed into smaller physical parts, but a mental process can't be. Physical parts just can't add up to a mental whole. Okay, so Nagel here, on behalf of the dualist, but also somewhat speaking for himself, is arguing that, look, these mental phenomena just can't be approached in the same way that we do when we're investigating physical ones, right? There are some features of these mental phenomena that don't allow them to be captured by the same language, tools, or techniques, right? Physical things can be divided. We can break them down and look at their parts. We can examine them piecemeal. That's not the case for mental things, right? The taste of chocolate, when you think about the taste of chocolate or whatever your favorite food is, right? Try to decompose it into smaller analyzable parts. What would that even mean? It doesn't seem to make sense. And try to think of a way to like physically pinpoint it. You're enjoying the taste of chocolate now. Where is that? Where is that taste, right? Nagel thinks it's kind of silly to try to like find these physical like counterparts, right? They don't exist, Nagel wants to say. Okay, so finally, Nagel is going to give us his own view. As a third contender, Nagel offers the following. But another possibility is that your mental life goes on in your brain, yet that all those experiences, feelings, thoughts, and desires are not physical processes in the brain. This would mean that the gray mass of billions of nerve cells in your skull is not just a physical object. It has lots of physical properties, great quantities of chemical and electrical activity going on in it, but it has mental processes going on in it as well. Okay, so what does this mean? Basically, Nagel is suggesting that yes, your mind is going on in your brain, right? Your mind is kind of your brain. That is the case. So the dualists are wrong in thinking that there's two separate things, right? That there's the brain and then there's the mind, and the two just aren't even the same substance. He thinks the dualist is wrong about that. But on the other hand, he thinks the physicalist is wrong in thinking that everything must be given a physical explanation and that the only things that exist are physical things. Nagel is suggesting here that the brain has properties, both mental and physical. One thing has both properties, right? It exhibits both mental features and physical features. Okay? This view, Nagel calls the dual aspect theory. It's a little old-fashioned, but it's a fair label. Most people who go into a review like this nowadays would probably call themselves neutral monists, right? They seem to believe something that we would call neutral monism. Okay, so neutral monism, breaking that down, monism in a philosophy is the belief that everything is made of one kind of thing, right? So physicalists are monists, right? Because they think that everything is physical. Dualists, on the other hand, not monists, because they think there are two things, right? Two things, not one. Okay, so to be a neutral monist is to say you believe there is one type of stuff and it is somehow neutral between mind stuff and physical stuff, right? It has both, right? It's both things. This substance, whatever it is, has both mental and physical properties. So in this way, Nagel is hoping that we can solve the mind-body problem, right? How do the mind and the body relate? Well, they are one and the same, right? The mind is a feature of the brain, right? It is part of the body. But there are important ways of understanding mental properties that are distinct from our ways of understanding physical ones, right? So if you just look at like the physical story of the brain, you're going to end up missing a very important story about the mind. Okay, conclusion then. We don't yet know enough in the course, right? We only just got started to say whether or not Nagel's used the right one, whether or not we should be neutral monists, right? But hopefully you now kind of understand the problem, right? When you think about the taste of chocolate, when you think about your beliefs and your thoughts, right, your feelings, they don't seem to be the kind of thing that you can at least very easily pinpoint in your brain, right? They don't seem to be the same kind of thing necessarily. But if they're not the same kind of thing, what are they, right? And is there a way that they could be the same kind of thing with more increased understanding, right? It's not yet clear, but now we kind of have a grasp of what the issue is here, right? This mind-body problem. How does the mind relate to the body? Okay, so next time we are going to jump into dualism, right? We're gonna start with Descartes. Descartes not only is like an incredibly influential dualist, but for better or worse, he has largely shaped all of the discussions in philosophy of mind today, right? Some people really dislike that fact, right? Others still kind of champion views somewhat similar to Descartes' views. But we'll attend to dualism next week. All right? Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.